We're knitting version 1 of our eyelet pattern, and I've just got a small sample here to demonstrate. We've been knitting in this direction and we're now ready to add in our sewing thread. So we're just going to do 2 rows. I'm using a different coloured yarn just for contrast purposes. Just leave a small tail that we'll weave in at the end. And then we're going to knit 2 rows with our sewing thread, but the first stitch we're going to knit together with our main yarn. So we'll hold both the main yarn and the contrast yarn and just knit the first stitch. And then we'll drop the main yarn and just finish the row using our sewing thread. Knitted 1 row of our sewing thread, so we'll turn around and just knit the second row. So I'm going to knit back until I get to the last stitch in this row. Purling, of course, because it's stocking stitch. So we're at our last stitch now, and our last stitch includes both the main yarn and the contrast yarn. We're going to pick up the main yarn again, hold it with the contrast yarn and knit that last stitch holding those 2 threads together, like so. Now we're going to turn our work around and just knit the last row, but we're going to change our needle size. If you're using 1 straight needle and 1 circular needle, then this is the time to use the straight needle. So I've got a straight 5.5mm needle here, and I'm going to knit this row just with the main yarn. So I'll knit across. So I've knitted across the row. At this point I'm just going to count the stitches just to make sure I've got the right number, so that when it comes to doing the graft I'm not going to get to the end of my graft and discover something's gone wrong. If you've got an extra stitch, just make sure that you've knitted both the contrast and the main yarn together at the end. Sometimes it's easy to treat those yarns as separate stitches. Before we cut our contrast thread, I'm just going to tie a knot between the 2 ends of the contrast sewing thread, and this just helps to make sure that the stitches aren't accidentally pulled more tightly when it comes to sewing up our side seams. So I'm just doing an overhand knot there, and then we'll just cut our sewing thread and weave that in when we do our side seaming. Now we're ready to move on to the next part of our eyelet pattern, and that starts with a provisional cast on. For our provisional cast on, you can use 2 separate cable needles. However, I've just got 1 long cable needle, and I'm going to hold the 2 ends together like so. So that's the way I'll be doing the provisional cast on. We're going to start by putting a slip knot onto the top needle. In your pattern you will see some guidelines for how long to leave the tail, and this is to allow you enough yarn to do both the provisional cast on and the final row. Just do our provisional slip knot at the distance that's indicated by the pattern, and we'll just slip that onto our top needle. Now we're going to take our ball of yarn and place it down below, and the tail of yarn is going to sit at the top like so. Holding both of the needles together, we're going to grab both the tail and the ball of yarn, and we're going to separate those yarns using our index finger and thumb like so. The tail yarn is going to create the stitches on the lower needle, and the ball of yarn is going to create the stitches on the top needle. We've got a stitch on our top needle already, so we're going to create a stitch on our lower needle using the tail yarn. So I'm going to move my needle so that the needles come above the tail yarn and just wrap the tail yarn around the lower needle, going back between the needles like so. Now we're going to create a stitch on our top needle. So we bring our needles down and pass the yarn between the two needles and then around over the top like so. Lower needle, so we bring the yarn below the needles, back through the middle. Top stitch, the yarn goes through the middle and around the top. Lower needle, yarn comes below the needles and through the middle, and so on. So I'm going to cast on the required number of stitches. Now, if your pattern said to cast on 100 stitches using this provisional cast on, then what you would do is have 100 stitches on the top needle and 100 stitches on the bottom. Because you start with a stitch on the top needle, you'll finish with a stitch on the bottom needle. I've cast on the correct number of stitches for my sample. At the end of your cast on, you want to just turn your work over and make sure that the yarns twist around each other, because this will secure the stitches to each other and you won't lose a stitch accidentally. Now we're going to flip our work around. I'll just place my finger over that twist to keep it in place so that the right side is facing. We'll bring our ball yarn down here, and this yarn here is my tail yarn. Just making sure that we're still twisted round the back. We're going to be working with the stitches on the top needle, so I'm just going to pull my lower needle to the right, and this brings the stitches onto the cable. This allows me a little bit more space to work with the upper stitches. We're now going to add in our contrast yarn, which is our sewing thread. And I'm going to knit across. The first stitch, again, will be holding the contrast yarn with the main yarn. And we'll knit with those two threads held together. Now I'm going to drop the main yarn and just continue knitting across using the sewing thread. So I've knitted the first row. Now I'm going to turn around and we'll purl our way back because this is the wrong side until we get to the very last stitch. So we've got to our last stitch. We're going to pick up our main colour yarn, which is this one here, making sure we pick up the tail and not the ball of yarn, and we're going to knit that, purl that last stitch together with the contrast yarn. Okay, now we are just going to tie a knot like we did before between our contrast yarns, just to keep those stitches at the right tension. Now we're just going to knit our last row, and we're going to knit across using a larger needle and the main yarn. For this section, you want to use the circular needle. So I've got a larger needle size, and I'm going to knit across. And we'll show you why you use the circular needle afterwards. So we've knitted across. We can cut our tail a bit shorter, just leaving 10 to 15 centimetres or 4 to 6 inches to sew in later. So we've got our last row on the larger circular needle, and this is our provisional cast on the lower cable here. When we graft our two sections together, we're going to be placing our top needle at the back and our lower needle at the front. And so in order to start our graft at this end, we'll need to slide the stitches to the other end of the circular needle so that both of the points are on the right hand side. And then we're ready to graft our two sections together. The instructions for that are in a separate video, but for now what I'm going to do is just show you how to pick up your knitting from here. Okay. So now we're going back to our provisional cast on, and we're going to start with the wrong side facing. And we'll just slide the stitches to the left hand side, to the right hand side, and I just like to count my stitches just to make sure I haven't accidentally lost a stitch in the process. So we're going to start with a purl side row, and we'll be continuing in stocking stitch until we get to our next eyelet pattern insertion. So this is what our eyelet insertion version 1 is going to look like before the graft. You may find it easier to do a couple more rows of stocking stitch before doing the graft, because sometimes having a little bit more space between these two needles makes the graft process easier. However, once you've got the hang of it, it's pretty straightforward.